You grow up being told the United States was never an empire. No colonies, no overseas domination, just freedom, democracy, and reluctant global leadership. But now imagine this. It's 1898. The US has just defeated Spain. The war is officially over. Spain is leaving the global stage. And on a table in Paris lies a map most Americans never talk about. Not Europe, not the Americas, but an archipelago of over 7,000 islands sitting 8,000 miles from Washington, the Philippines. For $20 million, the United States quietly buys the islands from Spain. Not land, not resources, but people. Over 7 million Filipinos transferred like property, without a vote, without consent. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a side quest. At the exact moment America was preaching anti-colonial values, it was building an overseas empire in Asia. And here's the uncomfortable part. Most history books skip. The Philippines didn't just become America's colony. They became America's testing ground for military power, economic control, and a new kind of empire that didn't call itself one. This is not a story about ancient history. This is about how the US learned to project power far beyond its borders and never stopped. So how does a country born from an anti-colonial revolution justify becoming a colonizer? Simple. You change the language. American leaders didn't call it empire. They called it benevolent assimilation. President William McKinley claimed the US had a moral duty to educate, uplift, and civilize the Filipino population. The language was soft, almost humanitarian, but on the ground, reality looked very different. Filipinos had already declared independence from Spain. They expected freedom. Instead, they got a new flag and a new master. When resistance began, Washington labeled it an insurrection, not a war, not a liberation struggle, an inconvenience. Between 1899 and 1902, the Philippine-American War killed an estimated 200,000 to 1 million civilians, many from famine, disease, and scorched earth campaigns. Entire villages were burned. Civilians were placed in concentration zones. Torture was openly documented. This wasn't rogue behavior. It was policy. The Philippines became the blueprint for modern American power. Military occupation, economic restructuring, cultural reprogramming, all wrapped in moral justification. And once America learned it could control territory without formally annexing it forever, a new strategy was born, one that would echo across the 20th century. Very quickly, Washington realized the Philippines were never just about helping Filipinos. They were about China, trade, and power projection. At the turn of the 20th century, Asia was the future. European empires were carving it up, and the US arrived late to the game. The Philippines solved that problem overnight. From Manila, the US Navy could reach China's ports, Japan's sea lanes, Southeast Asia's trade routes. The islands became America's unsinkable aircraft carrier decades before the term even existed. This wasn't subtle. American policymakers openly described the Philippines as a gateway to Asia. US corporations flooded in. Tariffs were rewritten. Filipino agriculture was reshaped to serve American markets. Sugar, coconut oil, tobacco. Local industries collapsed. Dependency grew. Filipinos were taught English. American textbooks rewrote history. US culture replaced local systems. Not by accident, but by design. And here's the key detail. The US didn't plan to integrate Filipinos as equals. Congress made that clear. Filipinos were classified as nationals, not citizens. They could fight and die under the American flag, but never fully belong under it. This wasn't freedom delayed. It was control without accountability. The Philippines became proof that the US could dominate territory, reshape societies, and extract strategic value, all while claiming moral superiority. And once that lesson was learned, it didn't stay in Asia. By the 1930s, the word empire was becoming politically inconvenient. So Washington pivoted. The U.S. promised eventual independence, but on American terms. In 1946, after World War II devastated the islands, the Philippines finally became independent. Flags changed, speeches were made, headlines celebrated the end of colonial rule. But the fine print told a different story. Before independence was granted, the U.S. forced the Philippines to accept the Bell Trade Act. It locked Filipino markets open to American goods, pegged the peso to the dollar, and gave U.S. corporations equal access to Philippine natural resources. Military bases followed. Clark Air Base, Subic Bay Naval Base. For decades, these were some of the largest American military installations outside U.S. territory. Independence, yes. But sovereignty? Not really. The Philippines had become something new. Not a colony, not an equal ally, but a strategic extension of American power. This was the real legacy of U.S. colonialism, a model where control outlives occupation, and once perfected, it would be exported globally, from Latin America to the Middle East. By the time the Cold War began, the Philippines were no longer a former colony, they were a frontline asset. Washington didn't see Manila as a sovereign partner. It saw it as a listening post, a launchpad, and a buffer against communism in Asia. After China's revolution in 1949 and the Korean War, U.S. fear hardened into doctrine. Any instability in the Philippines was treated not as a domestic issue, but as a threat to American interests. So the U.S. backed power over democracy. When inequality, land concentration, and rural poverty fueled left-wing movements, Washington didn't ask why. It asked, how fast can we suppress this? American military advisors trained Philippine forces. Counterinsurgency tactics developed during colonial rule were refined and reused. Surveillance, forced relocations, paramilitary units, all justified in the name of stability. And then came the dictators. In 1965, Ferdinand Marcos rose to power. By 1972, he declared martial law. Civil liberties were crushed, billions were looted, thousands were imprisoned, tortured, or disappeared. The U.S. knew, and it supported him anyway. Why? Because Marcos guaranteed U.S. bases, loyalty, and anti-communist alignment. Once again, Filipino democracy was sacrificed for American strategy. The pattern was clear. As long as the Philippines served U.S. interests, internal repression was acceptable collateral damage. Colonialism had evolved, but it hadn't disappeared. So what did this legacy leave behind? A country formally independent, yet structurally constrained. The Philippine economy became export-dependent. Millions of Filipinos were pushed into overseas labor to survive. Remittances replaced industrial development. American culture dominated media, education, and political imagination. English opened doors, but also erased languages and histories. Even today, defense agreements allow U.S. troops rotational access to Philippine bases. Not colonies, not occupation, just partnership. But partnerships assume equality, and this one never truly did. Here's the deeper consequence. The Philippines didn't just lose land or resources, it lost the ability to choose its own path without external pressure. That's the real cost of America's colonial footprint. Not flags or borders, but long-term dependency disguised as alliance. And this isn't just about the Philippines. It's about how modern empires operate without calling themselves empires. Ask most Americans whether the U.S. ever had an empire, and the answer is usually no. Empires have emperors. Empires rule by force. Empires collapse. America, the story goes, only builds alliances. But the Philippines expose the contradiction. The U.S. didn't just influence the islands, it owned them, it ruled them. It rewired their economy, education system, military and political class, then walked away without undoing the damage. And instead of reckoning with that history, America buried it. The Philippine-American War barely exists in U.S. textbooks. The civilian death toll is disputed, softened, or ignored. Colonial language is replaced with trusteeship and guidance. This selective memory wasn't accidental, because admitting the Philippines were a colony would force a bigger question. How many modern U.S. interventions follow the same logic? Control without accountability? Power without responsibility? The Philippines weren't an exception. They were the prototype. Today, the U.S. and the Philippines are once again bound by security agreements. This time, aimed at China. History is repeating itself, just with cleaner language. The geography hasn't changed. The power imbalance hasn't changed. Only the branding has. Understanding America's colonial footprint in the Philippines isn't about assigning guilt. It's about understanding how power actually works. Empires don't always arrive with crowns and conquest. Sometimes they arrive with contracts, advisors, and promises of protection. The Philippines show us that colonialism doesn't end when a flag comes down. It ends when a nation can finally act without permission. And that's a chapter still being written.